So we get questions on this pretty regularly.
Yep.
About people wondering basically like, hey, like I've done a VO2 max test and I have a number now, like what do I do with it, right? Or how do I figure this out? Am I stuck at this forever? That was another thing that we've talked about, and a lot of people question, like basically, am I just always going to be 68?
That's just been a fact in the endurance world.
Air quotes fact.
Yeah. Well, it's been a fact like anything else is a fact. Like lactate is poison used to be a fact.
Yeah.
So. This is what I've always heard, is that your VO2 max is what it is. You can change your body composition, but like how much you can take in is what it is. But you can train your power at VO2 max.
Yeah, that's like been the common consensus.
And I'm as guilty as anybody for perpetuating that belief, because that's the information I had and that's the information I rolled with. But anecdotally, I've seen evidence otherwise, and there's science surfacing on a pretty regular basis that demonstrates that as well. Longtime coaches are starting to post that. I've seen, and I'll get into one particular coach in a little bit, but that's some inaccurate information.
So VO2 max isn't static; it isn't stuck.
Very much not.
It's interesting, right?
And there are a few
Tell us
cases.
more.
I'll explain
I'm
what those cases are.
listening.
So let's just right out of the gates. VO2 max is trainable. That's where I'm going with this entire discussion. So VO2 max is synonymous with aerobic capacity. So you just basically your maximum level of O2 consumption, the upper limit of your aerobic ATP production. So how much energy can I make aerobically? We've talked a number of times about power of VO2 max, and then there's velocity of VO2 max for runners. Speed of VO2 max is sometimes used. And those, that basically you're just opening up a debate there, because it's really tough to put a single power on VO2 max, because it has to be tied to duration.
Yep.
Anytime you're above threshold, you can achieve VO2 max eventually. You can do it really quick if you gas it. You can do it over a greater length of time if you ease up a bit and you're riding just slightly over FTP. But the fact is, if you're above FTP, if you're above that quasi-steady state metabolic platform, so to speak, you'll eventually get there.
That's like the end of a time trial when you think you're at threshold, but it's not threshold. Yeah. At the end, you're like,
yeah, that's not threshold breathing.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's some terms like you'll probably hear fractional utilization, and that's, I mean, if you do any reading at all, and that's just the percentage of VO2 max you're working at. So what we want, and this is especially in the context of FTP, we want a high fractional utilization. We want to work at a high percentage of our VO2 max when we're at FTP. We want to employ as much of our aerobic resources as possible.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. So I look at this more in terms of volume of uptake. So just VO2. Who cares about max? I mean, max is useful if you want to go into a lab and measure it. It has its utility, don't get me wrong, but really we're just looking at VO2, or more generally aerobic fitness. That's all we're talking about here. How much can I do aerobically? So I wanted to briefly trace the path of oxygen, just so we understand maybe why they say it's not trainable, but each of these spots along the way targets why it is possible, how we can affect all these things, and therefore we can improve aerobic capacity in the process.
Yeah, that would be helpful, because just a couple of weeks ago we talked about glycogen and how that gets converted into energy. So this is kind of running in parallel.
And that's the idea.
Into your lungs and then into your legs.
yeah, simplistically, it's fast.
Thank you, Nate.
Description, but yeah,
Via blood.
Yep.
It really does.
Yes, it's true.
It is true. It is true. Okay, but we're going to take I limited it to 4 steps. Cool. So path of oxygen, your mouth and your nose are basically your inlet, your intake. So it's pretty straightforward. Comes into the mouth, comes into the nose, makes its way down to your lungs, heart, and blood. So past the intake point, this is where the exchange occurs. And this is where we talk about respiratory exchange ratios and all the stuff that happens with O2 in, CO2 out. So that's where the exchange takes place. And then the blood vessels themselves, you're into the heart at this point. Blood comes into the lungs, it's oxygenated, it's pushed out through particular blood vessels. These blood vessels get smaller and smaller until eventually they work down to the muscle level, where they reach the capillary beds. So these are the finest blood vessels we have within the muscles, and this is where all the exchange of everything occurs. This is where we dump off oxygen, pick up waste, clear lactate, all that stuff takes place at this level. So capillaries and capillarization, depending on if you're Canadian or American or English or British, capillarization is one thing we can absolutely influence, and in doing so, we improve our ability to facilitate this exchange, to deliver more oxygen to the muscle, to clear more waste, et cetera.
So that's evidence of the fact that it could be trainable. Could be
yes.
improved.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the most common adaptations to endurance training is increased capillarization. So that's basically the delivery. The blood vessels are responsible for the delivery. And then at the muscle, this is where the actual uptake or the consumption, what we're measuring when we measure VO2 max or really any level of uptake, this is where it occurs, and specifically in the mitochondria. So harken back to a couple weeks ago when we talked about cell respiration, we talked about how it's in the mitochondria that the aerobic end of respiration takes place, and that's where we generate the biggest bang for our buck in terms of energy in, ATP out.
Got it.
Or substrate in, ATP out. So with that in mind, what determines VO2 max? First off, there's cardiac output. So we go back up to the lungs and the heart, and we can look at a couple things. And one is stroke volume. How much blood does our heart push out with every contraction? And that is basically tied to the left ventricle. We don't really have to get that specific, but just know that you can, with training, influence how much blood your heart can pump with each contraction.
That is where it's often a question. My heart rate went down for is that a good thing or a bad thing, my max heart rate? And it can be, it's the volume, stroke volume rather than rate.
Yeah, and that's what happens.
Together.
You're actually getting fitter and you can do more work, but your heart rate declined. What happened? Well, your heart got more capable of pushing more blood per beat.
For gearheads, it's like bore and stroke of a motor. There are two different things that determine
Same
what it
idea.
can make
You got
power. Exactly. It's not just heart rate, right?
And improvements in cardiac output, so your stroke volume, and then of course the other end of that is heart rate, how many times your heart beats. Improvements in cardiac output have pretty much been attributed over the years to high volume, low intensity training. The only way you're going to bump that up is by doing the long miles and doing it consistently. But Paul Larson, Martin Buchheit have pointed out that you can achieve improvements in cardiac output through high intensity training as well. And it's about manipulating recovery intervals and the structure of the intervals. But you can get absolutely in the weeds, but this is what I do, and this is what these workouts do for you, whether you understand this or not.
Yeah, it works.
So you can affect cardiac output both with long, slow distance and with high intensity training is the takeaway. Another thing that determines VO2 max is your oxygen carrying capacity. So you think of basically your hemoglobin content, and that's another thing that we can influence with training. The affinity for oxygen, which you experienced when you went up to elevation, and the affinity rose, and your blood simply wasn't letting go of the oxygen the way it usually does.
Yep.
And then, of course, your red blood cell count through training, through altitude exposure and certain other, I think, do we attribute that to sauna training? No, that's plasma volume.
Yeah.
But anyway, we can change we can improve our red blood cell content, which means, we mess with our hematocrit. We change the plasma, we mess with our hematocrit. So our concentration changes, but if we have more red blood cells, it's a win. We can carry more oxygen, we can deliver more oxygen, we can do more work aerobically.
That is why the people took EPO.
Back in the day. That's exactly why.
There we go.
The people.
Back in the day. Never these days. Yeah.
Okay, and then another thing that determines VO2 max are, in surprise to nobody, muscle characteristics. And within the muscle itself, we're talking about the capillaries that I just talked about. We're talking about the enzymes, in particular aerobic enzymes, PDH, LDH. These things also increase with endurance training. And then fiber type plays into it too. If you think about the fiber continuum, the slow twitch all the way to the fast twitch, you've got your slow oxidative, you got your slow oxidative glycolytic, where we kind of get to those type 2A fibers, but still oxidative, and then your fast oxidative glycolytic, still the type 2As. But the fact is, 3 different fiber types along that continuum all have oxidative capacity, and even our fast twitch have oxidative capacity to some extent too. So the fibers definitely play into it, and the more slow twitch you are, the easier it is, or not, the more likely, I guess I'll say easier, to bring your FTP to a higher percentage of your VO2 max, because you're a more aerobically inclined athlete.
Yeah.
And then the mitochondria. This is really what it boils down to, is our mitochondria. And mitochondria, both in terms of their quantity and, in quotes, quality. So quantity, again, has been something that if you want to increase mitochondrial proliferation, you want more of these little energy factories in your cells, in your muscles, long, slow distance. But over the years, we've discovered high intensity training, sprint intensity training. So many things can also improve, maybe not to the same extent, but can also improve the proliferation. And then the quality, this is what's typically attributable to high intensity training. If you want to improve the function of your mitochondria, how well they work, how much energy they can extract for every bit of oxygen that goes in, that's largely attributed to high intensity training.
Yep.
So, but there's
who cares how many you have if they aren't working efficiently, right?
Well, yeah, they have to be healthy mitochondria, and that extends to every aspect of life. If you don't have healthy mitochondria, you're going to suffer in more ways than your endurance performance.
Yeah, no doubt.
Okay, so with all that in mind, Just look at some examples. And if you've heard of Oscar Svensson, he was a kid, in pretty recent memory, who set the basic upper limit of VO2 max. He didn't, they say, eclipsed Bjorn Dahli's 96 VO2 max when he went 96.7. I don't necessarily consider that eclipsing. He definitely beat it. But he's an interesting case, and he is the high end of things. So, we can only make so much of this, and he's one person too, but I'll talk about other cyclists as well, or other athletes as well. So at 15, he came in untrained with a 74.6. Now, VO2 max is measured either relative to body weight or absolute. When we measure it relative to body weight, that's milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute. So with that aside, just know he's at 74. That's already very high. So untrained, he's got a 74 VO2 max. A lot of people will train years and years and years,
never get there,
and never touch that.
Most masters racers aren't there.
Yep.
It's a sad truth.
Highly trained.
Although, is it a truth? We'll see. So 6 months worth of training, he elevated that to 83.4. Another year of training, 86.8. So he's taken up. But then another year, obviously some training alteration. I don't know. They didn't specify exactly what. This is when he pulled the 96.7. So reestablished the records. And of course, they questioned the machinery, recalibrated the machinery, tested other athletes to confirm, and indeed 96.7 was the stat. Later that same year, he dropped to 92.8, and that's what a lot of people throw around. They say, 96.7 wasn't accurate, it's 92.8. Well, in fact, it was accurate. He actually added a little bit of weight, and if you look at his absolute VO2 max, it went from 7.397 down to 7.307.
And that's a big point to take away on this, is that he didn't just lose weight the whole time to raise it.
Nope. In fact, the weight was a small, if even, maybe not even an important aspect of this. Then takes 15 months off, decides, I don't want to be a cyclist, I don't like the pressure, I don't like whatever. He didn't like it. He moved on. 15 months of doing not a whole lot of anything, it declined back to 77. It returned back to where he was. But what's the takeaway here is this kid went from a 77 up to a 97 back to a 77, thereabouts. That's a massive change. And in terms of percentage, that's huge. And body weight wasn't a big contributor to that ratio. They looked at relative, they looked at absolute. Kid's got a big margin.
Yeah.
But again, he's just one example.
So that's why we just talked about it. You are detrained right now, and you've fallen from grace very far.
Taking a break. Long break.
But that's what I'm saying. The same. What was it, like a 20-point swing?
Yeah.
Right. That's insane.
Yeah. 20 mils per milkigments.
Is it liters or mils? Liters per
milliliters when you do
per
it
kilogram
relative to body
per
weight,
hour.
and then liters when you do it absolute. And when you're looking at big numbers in terms of absolute VO2 max, you're looking in the sevens. So 7 liters a minute, that's an enormous aerobic engine.
Wow. That's proof that it was trainable within this
bit of evidence, and in this kid's case, but you could say that kid's an outlier. So he just has a very trainable VO2 max. But Ronestad and Hansen posted published a study last year, 2018. Came across it again the other day, and it reminded me that it also, in this case, they dealt with a single elite athlete. So again, we're talking about one, but I'm gonna get into the bigger numbers later, the more applicable numbers later. They had 10 years of testing data on this particular athlete, and his VO2 max hovered between 65 and 76.5. So we're talking like a 10 mil per kilogram per minute margin. So 65 to 75. That already is outside of what they say is what's capable, 5 to 15%. That's been the statistic over time. Is at best you can maybe bump your VO2 max up 15%, and that's probably from an untrained state. This guy in particular, and I tried really hard to find out who this cyclist was, but I couldn't. Was training about 10 hours a week, so not a huge training load, but
more than you.
But in doing so, exhibited a 20% change in VO2 max, just training 10 hours a week. I don't care what he was doing. It was only 10 hours a week. And you can bet it wasn't all intervals. No one can do 10 hours of intervals a week. So what they did with this cyclist, after 10 years, was subjected him to 58 weeks of a different training intervention. And it's not really important what that intervention is so much as to say they changed his training. In the process, they elevated his training load about 3 hours a week. Obviously, the composition of it changed. Well, not obviously, it did. The composition of the training itself changed also. Now the guy's 37 years old. VO2 max, 87. He pushed it up to 87.
Wow.
Simply by changing things, adding on average 3 hours a week and going with a different training method.
Interesting.
And it was still a very training method, might I add. Not a polarized approach,
Yeah.
just so we're clear.
Yeah.
It was a mix. I think you said it was a mix.
It was a pretty even mix between low intensity, mid intensity, and high intensity training.
Threshold,
and
sweet
a
spot,
pretty healthy
everything.
mix of them all.
Yeah.
Leaning heavily toward the low intensity side of things, but
Sure.
still with a
When he's ramping up volume like that.
hefty dose of threshold sweet spot work, hefty dose of high intensity interval training.
That's a good segue, or a good thing I want to say is that, I don't know how to say it. If you want to get to 13 hours a week and you're on our high volume training plans, because there's around 8 or 9, Chad, what can you add? Can I add more intervals? We talked about it earlier.
Typically not. I mean, you know if you can, but that's a delicate balance. And as soon as you push yourself to the other side, as soon as that scale drops to the unfavorable side, you know it, and it can be a tough road back.
Oh, yeah.
It's definitely a training interruption.
So what do we add?
So why not err on the side of caution and just do it with more volume, more low intensity volume?
Yeah.
And you can do it in so many ways. And Nate demonstrated or talked about one of those ways, which is just tacking on a longer cool down at the end of a workout. 15 minutes over, say you do it 4 times in a week, that's an extra hour of volume, and you really didn't cut into anything else. You're already on the bike, you just tacked on another 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Voila, a whole extra hour.
You got to think of like who doesn't, like, when you get off the bike. I don't know. I always waste 15 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
I go
Oh,
on Strava, like
100%.
Just don't go on Strava.
I may still be sitting on the
I
bike,
love Strava.
looking at my phone, reading, just not turning the pedals. Why not turn the pedals?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. I'm doing these morning 30-minute ones, trying to get extra volume, and I literally would sit in bed for 30 minutes and like check like work stuff. Now I can just do it on the bike as I turn the pedals.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, so really, let me just tidy up this this elite cyclist that we're talking about. So this was basically an 18.5% increase in VO2 max relative to his body weight. Turns out, lost a little bit of body weight, so that skews that number a bit. So if we look at absolute, he still saw a 12% increase. He's been doing this for 10 years, hovering in a pretty narrow range, and now he's bumped his VO2 max up 12.3% absolute at 37 years of age.
Further evidence.
Further evidence.
It's funny because you hear this a lot, especially like when you hear about like Grand Tour riders and that sort of stuff, and they go, oh yeah, that rider has a high VO2 max, so thusly he's like, you know, he's destined for greatness.
Yeah, and
that rider has a low one, he's capped, he's never going to be.
That's what we thought, and it was...
Sure, some people have more genetic predisposition to be able to reach higher heights than
There
others.
is a huge genetic component. There is.
But it doesn't mean that it's
not as limiting as we thought it was.
Exactly.
Is what we're finding.
100%.
Is what they're finding. And
Interesting, Chad.
What I'm finding. Okay, so another guy, Falk Hansen, he's a PhD. He's basically the master of glycogen in general, glycogen metabolism. Or
The master of
glucose
glycogen.
metabolism. Dude's a PhD in that particular thing, so he knows a whole lot about it.
It totally does sound like a
But what he pointed out, what was very interesting to me is now we're talking the old end of things. And typically I'll say masters athletes or veteran athletes. We're talking old, just old in this case. This dude's 101 years old.
Okay, that is old.
That's
I
old.
thought you were
Yeah,
going to be like say
That's
something
old.
offensive. But
55. No, 101 years
55's not
old. 101 years old. This guy starts with a 30 VO2 max, which at 100 years old, no, that sounds about right. Okay. Decides he's going to do a world hour record attempt. So he trains for 2 years,
So cool.
logs 5,000 kilometers a year. That's not a lot. That's 1,000 kilometers per week on average.
100 kilometers.
I'm sorry, 100.
1,000
is a lot.
Whoa.
100 kilometers
years
a week.
old.
So we're talking 60 kilometers a week, and the fact that they put it in kilometers per week tells me he might just be riding. Might not be doing intervals, might not be doing specific training, but over the course of these 2 years, doing 5,000 K per year, elevated his his VO2 max at 101 years of age, 13%.
There you go.
That's a big jump at 100.
That'd be the most scary thing ever to like prescribe training for a 101-year-old. That'd be
know.
like pressure on the pedals.
That's probably why he did just go ride. Just go ride, and when you're tired, come home.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah.
Yep.
Wow, amazing,
Okay,
man.
so last but not least, Alan Cousins, it's probably pronounced Cousins, longtime endurance coach of triathletes. He's a very reputable coach. Man knows his stuff. He was working with, in particular, a youngish mid-pack triathlete who is at a perpetual plateau. And we've all been there. We figure, my FTP gets this high and it just doesn't go any higher. I'm here to tell you that is absolutely not the case. In most cases, and I'll describe why momentarily. He had a 53 VO2 max, and he wanted to qualify for Kona World Championships. And, most coaches would just say, sorry, buddy, it's not happening.
Right.
Because even at 53, if you can achieve a 10% bump, we're looking at, the whole 5 to 15% range that has been touted up until now, that gets him, maybe a 58 VO2 max?
Still
That's still
high.
not going to put you at a place where you're probably qualifying for Kona. So what does he do? But And this is a 3-year timeline. So he trained with, and Cousin's approach in this case was simply to elevate long, slow distance. So he had him do it from the low end. Low intensity training over the course of 3 years, pushed a 53 VO2 max to 74.
There you go.
That puts him up into the elites. I mean, that's an impressive VO2 max, and he did qualify for Kona. And his trajectory went from a 53 to a 64 to a 71. So each year, that's already super motivating. And he continued it to elevate even slightly beyond that to the 74.6, and in the process qualified for Kona, and showed that even though he looked like a very maybe sub-average endurance athlete, pushed himself to the point of elite.
And it wasn't just body composition changes?
Not in this case. No, and he did
probably a
provide,
mix of it.
did
Probably
provide the
some.
body weight. I'm sure there was, but the absolute, in fact,
Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
yeah, I
We
didn't
can
note
trust
that.
you. Okay.
I didn't note that. But if you go to, I can't think of what Cousin's website is.
Maybe if someone has a question in the forum, we can
Yeah.
look at it later.
Yeah, we
Jump
can
into the
totally, we can
forum.
link to this exact post too.
Yeah.
But what Cousins has noticed over the years, and he's coached a lot of endurance athletes, a lot of triathletes, is that 5 to 15% is some nonsense. And on average, he sees something more in the range of 25%. He sees athletes come in, start here, finish at doing it right, 25%. And the key to this is the right training done for a sufficient amount of time. And that's what most of the studies that say VO2 max isn't trainable. It's genetically predetermined. You can't, you're stuck with what you're stuck with, don't take into account. They try one training alteration, they do it for one block of time, and typically it's a pretty short block of time. And of course, there's not a big change, if there's a change at all, in VO2 max. But you do the right type of training and you do it long enough, and you see big changes in your aerobic capacity.
I feel for the people with studies too, is they don't have the money or probably the subjects that are motivated enough to be like, we're going to go for 3 years, people.
Yep.
And you're going to
3
do
years
this
of
training
constant
plan.
Nobody
training.
wants to look at a 3-year
Right.
timeline anyway. They
Yeah.
want to be fast now.
Yep.
So there are alterations, but to that end, you can achieve. In fact, I did note that. Oh yeah. So Cousins points this out. That on average he sees about a 24% increase if they go the high volume, low intensity approach. But we're talking 15, 18, 20 hours a week in order to do this, and we're also talking numerous years in a row. Approach it from the other end of things, and you go a short term 4 to 6 week VO2 max block, or just a couple days of VO2 max within your week, and you can still see, and he sees on average about 16%.
Yeah.
So just from a 4 to 6 week training intervention, doing high intensity work, big bump in VO2 max.
It's like our build or specialty.
Yep. Exactly.
Yep.
Lots
It
of
works.
There's a method to my madness, to our madness. Okay, so
Interesting.
some takeaways
madness.
that I'd like to put.
Don't include us in your madness, Chad.
Madness. So some takeaways. First off, when you're maxed out genetically through training, you probably are up against that ceiling. But how many of us are maxed out?
Oh, yeah. I feel like so few of us.
So few.
Yeah.
And then which is to say the VO2 improvements can be achieved at almost all levels. It doesn't matter if you're elite already and you think you can't push it any higher, you probably can. If you're untrained, obviously you can. And if you're stuck at a plateau, probably can. You just need to change things up. And again, there are numerous ways to go about it. We talked about low intensity, high volume, mid intensity, sweet spot, and endurance threshold type stuff. High intensity training like VO2 max quote intervals, sprint intensity training, 30-second efforts. All of these things can have a positive influence on your aerobic capacity. And finally, the single takeaway is simply that physiology and even genetics do not necessarily equate to destiny. You can influence both your FTP, obviously, which we know is highly trainable, and your VO2 max. Which brings me to the final point that we're always concerned with. When we hit that plateau, we think that's it. That's all the higher my FTP goes. And they say, go back and I need to work on your VO2 max, but I can't elevate VO2 max. Well, now you know you can. So if you're paying attention to these two things, and you don't necessarily have to measure VO2 max, you don't have to measure, we all measure FTP, but to know the margin between them. You can look at, what's my best 4, 5, maybe 6 minute power, and how does that compare to my threshold power? When that margin gets really narrow, you've got to go back and focus on the VO2 max work. If you want to improve performance past that point, you can't simply keep on doing sweet spot work. You can't keep doing low intensity work. You're going to have to find a way to elevate, a different way to elevate.
This is built into our plans, but I get this where I do sweet spot over and over and over again because I enjoy sweet spot and it gets me to be a diesel. But you've mentioned on this
And that's what
podcast,
sweet
I
spot
need to
does
jump into
really well.
Build and specialty plans.
Once you've reached a point, sweet spot can just tick that FTP up for a very long time. And then even if you don't want to elevate FTP anymore, but you want to be able to work at a high percentage of FTP or, more accurately, a high percentage of your VO2 max, sweet spot's an awesome way to do it. And in the process, you do garner some aerobic benefits, some aerobic adaptation simply doing sweet spot. There will come a point where it's not going to do any more for you, and you can't just keep on heaping on sweet spot. The body simply can't.
Same could be
tolerate
said for
more
any
of it.
sort of training.
Exactly. So that's when you know you have to change the stimulus, and again, you have to do it for an appropriate period of time.
This is why you thought of all this in the plans, right?
It is. Even if I didn't understand exactly these findings, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the basic principles behind it, right? I'd be really interested to see somebody like Matt Lieto, for example. You know, he famously has shared his story about how, like, when the first year, was he at Kona when he was handing up water to somebody at a race or something, and he was trying to run after them to hand them the water, and he said he was fat and slow and couldn't do it.
Yeah, that's right. And they were in the middle of a marathon.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, in the
marathon pace after 112-mile bike in the heat.
Yeah, it'd be so interesting, right? Because then Matt became, and still is, like an insanely strong athlete.
It'd be cool to see his absolute, because obviously relative.
Yeah,
he would have great improvements. But
it's not always as telling as I'd like it to be, but take a look at your mom. I mean, maybe your mom never exploited her athletic potential, but if you're a good endurance athlete, you got that from your mom. All your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mom's side of things, 100%.
Interesting. Huh.
So if you have a stellar endurance athlete of a mother, that definitely weighs in your favor.
Taylor Finney comes to mind.
Yeah, one of many.
Yep. If you like this video, you should subscribe to our channel. Maybe even give this video a like with a thumbs up and a comment down below.
If you want to see race analysis videos, you can click on it right over here. And if you want to get your coaching questions answered, you can click on it right over here.
And if you want to become a faster cyclist, which you should go over to TrainerRoad.com. It'll make you faster. We promise. We guarantee it, right, Nate?
Guaranteed. Or your money back.
Yes, it's true, actually. We really will do that.
Yeah.